Tonight, I'm going to tell you the entire timeline of the T virus. I'll leave timestamps and sections in the description so you can come back easily if you drift off or need to pause. Please subscribe and like if you enjoy. It helps the channel grow and tells me you enjoyed it, which means a lot. The story of the Umbrella Corporation doesn't begin in a laboratory, but in the soil of a forgotten kingdom. Deep within the Kijuju region of West Africa, a rare flower known as the Sonnentreppe, or the Stairway to the Sun, grew in the shadows of an ancient underground garden. This flower was more than a botanical curiosity. It was the host for a natural, ancient retrovirus that would eventually be named the Progenitor Virus. It's a biological engine that operates with a lethal level of efficiency, capable of rewriting the genetic code of any living cell it touches. For the vast majority of hosts, this process is too violent to survive, leading to immediate cellular collapse and death. However, the Progenitor Virus wasn't just a bringer of decay. In the rare cases where a host's DNA was compatible, the virus granted gifts that seemed almost supernatural. These survivors emerged with increased physical strength, a significantly longer lifespan, and heightened intelligence. It was this potential for human evolution that made the virus the foundation for every biological weapon that would follow. It's the mother strain, the raw material from which an entire industry of horror was manufactured. And the virus's ability to mutate and adapt is what makes it so dangerous and yet so attractive to those who seek power. It doesn't just kill, it changes what it means to be alive. The discovery of this RNA-based organism in 1966 marked the end of the natural world's isolation from corporate ambition. Everything, from the shambling dead to the most advanced combat organisms, traces its lineage back to this single, ancient source. It's the original sin of a scientific era that prioritized results over human life. Imagine the moment those first researchers looked through a microscope and realized they'd found something that could redesign the human race. They weren't looking at a disease. They were looking at a tool. It's a virus that demands a price for its power, usually paid in blood and cellular ruin. This ancient retrovirus stayed hidden for centuries, protected by the very people who understood its power best, until 3 men from the West arrived to claim it. The Progenitor Virus represents a fundamental shift in how humanity interacts with biology. Before its discovery, mutation was a slow process of natural selection. Now, it was something that could be triggered in a single generation. This volatility is what made the research so expensive and so dangerous. It's a virus that refuses to be tamed, even by the people who built a company around it. Long before Umbrella's logo was ever designed, the Endipaya Tribe lived among the ruins of an ancient settlement in West Africa. They were the guardians of the Garden of the Sun and the flowers that grew within it. Their relationship with the Progenitor Virus wasn't scientific, but it was deeply practical and brutal. They didn't have laboratories or sequence maps, but they understood the fundamental truth of the flower. Survive it, and you become something more. The tribe used the Sonnentreppe in a ritual known as the King's Selection. Their huntsmen would eat the flower, essentially gambling their lives for the right to lead. Most of them died in agony as the virus rejected their biology, but the ones who survived became the legends of the Ndipaya, living for hundreds of years and possessing a physical prowess that ensured the tribe's survival against all threats. They built a civilization around this biological superiority, living in a world where the monsters were their kings. The Ndipaya didn't need to understand the virology to know that the flower was sacred. They treated the garden as a holy site, keeping the rest of the world away from a power that most humans couldn't handle. It was a tradition of survival that lasted for generations, a closed loop of evolution that stayed buried in the Kijuju region. They knew that the price of their strength was the pile of bodies left behind by every failed selection. When you think about the Endipaya, you're looking at the only group of people who ever truly respected what the Progenitor Virus was. They didn't try to mass produce it or turn it into a product. They just lived with it, understanding that the garden was a place of both life and death. That balance was destroyed the moment the outside world arrived with a different set of priorities. The tribe's ancient tradition was about to become a global nightmare. This indigenous civilization had mastered a biological weapon without ever calling it one. They lived in harmony with a force that would eventually destroy Raccoon City. Their history is a reminder that the T-virus didn't come from a vacuum. It was stolen from a culture that had learned to fear it. The ruins they left behind were the first labs, and their huntsmen were the first test subjects. In 1966, the silence of the Ndipaya's ruins was broken by three men who arrived with a specific, cold-blooded intention. Oswell Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus weren't there to explore. They were there to harvest. They'd spent years following the journals of 19th century explorers, hunting for the source of the Ndipaya's legends. On December 4th of that year, they found the garden and confirmed that the virus within the flower was exactly what they'd hoped for. The expedition wasn't a humanitarian effort or a quest for knowledge for its own sake. It was a privately funded program designed to find a shortcut to human evolution. They took the virus from the Ndipaya, treating the tribe's sacred site as a resource to be plundered. This theft laid the foundation for everything that followed, transforming an ancient ritual into a corporate asset. They didn't care about the culture they were destroying. They only cared about the samples they were carrying back to the West. This moment in 1966 is the true starting point for the Resident Evil timeline. It's the point where a natural virus became a manufactured one. The three men returned home, not as scientists who'd made a discovery, but as owners of a new kind of power. They knew that the Progenitor Virus was too volatile to be used in its raw state, so they needed a way to fund the decades of research required to stabilize it. Umbrella was born out of this expedition, created specifically to provide the money and the secrecy needed to master the virus. The garden in Africa was left behind, but the samples they took would eventually destroy cities. It's a classic story of human arrogance, where three men believed they could control a force that an entire tribe had spent centuries just trying to survive. The expedition was a success on paper, but it started a chain of events that could never be unmade. The extraction process was difficult, as the virus required the living flower to remain stable. They couldn't just take the seeds. They had to understand the environment that allowed the Sonnentreppe to grow. This forced them to establish a presence in Africa that would last for decades. It was the first step in a global expansion that would eventually place umbrella laboratories in every corner of the world. The partnership between Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus was fractured from the very beginning. While they shared a goal of finding the virus, their reasons for wanting it were completely different. Oswell Spencer was the architect of the company's grander, more sinister vision. He was a man driven by eugenics, believing that he could use the Progenitor Virus to create a new breed of superior humans with himself as their god king. To Spencer, the virus wasn't a medicine. It was a filter to weed out the weak. Edward Ashford was a more conventional scientist, and he was the only one who seemed to have any interest in the medical potential of their discovery. He wanted to use the virus's regenerative properties to treat disabilities and diseases, a goal that put him at odds with Spencer's more violent ambitions. His focus on genetic engineering would eventually lead to the Veronica Project, but his conscience made him a liability in Spencer's eyes. James Marcus was the technician, a man obsessed with the biological mechanics of mutation. He didn't care about god kings or medicine as much as he cared about what the virus could do when merged with other organisms. He spent his years in isolation, pushing the limits of what the Progenitor Virus could rewrite. His obsession was purely scientific, but it was a cold, heartless kind of science that didn't value human life any more than Spencer did. These three competing visions meant that the Umbrella Corporation was always fighting itself. Spencer provided the money and the political cover. Ashford provided the scientific legitimacy, and Marcus provided the results. But as soon as the research began to produce real data, and the founders started looking for ways to eliminate each other. It's a reminder that the horror of the T virus started with the human rot at the top of the company. Spencer's eventual betrayal of Ashford in 1968 removed the last shred of ethical restraint from the project. With Ashford gone, the research shifted entirely toward weaponization and eugenics. The company's soul was sold before it ever produced its first product. Marcus and Spencer were left alone to see who could build a more efficient monster first. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was established in 1967 as a legitimate front for a very illegitimate program. To the public, it was a trusted healthcare company that sold vitamins, cosmetics, and first aid sprays. It built a reputation for excellence and reliability, employing thousands of people who had no idea what the company was actually doing. This public face was essential because it provided the massive profits needed to fund the founders' private research. The real work was happening in places that didn't appear on any corporate map. Underground laboratories were built in the Arklay Mountains, beneath Raccoon City, and in remote locations across Europe and Antarctica. These facilities were designed for one purpose: to experiment with the Progenitor Virus without government oversight or ethical restrictions. The consumer products were just a smokescreen to keep the world's attention away from the monsters being built in the basement. Spencer managed this separation between the two faces of the company with a level of skill that lasted for nearly 30 years. He used the political connections he'd built as an English lord to ensure that any questions about Umbrella's operations were quickly silenced. The company's reach was global, but its core was a small circle of men who answered to no one. It was a corporate structure designed to protect a secret, not to serve the public. When you realize that the money from your household medicine was funding the development of the T virus, the horror of Umbrella becomes much more personal. They built a city-sized dependency on their products while secretly preparing for that city's destruction. Umbrella wasn't just a company. It was a parasitic organism that fed on the society it claimed to protect. The labs were the reality. She and the pharmacies were just the camouflage. The profits from first aid sprays alone were enough to fund entire B.O.W.s programs. Every time a consumer bought a tube of Umbrella toothpaste, they were unknowingly contributing to the research that would eventually produce the Tyrant. This financial independence meant that Spencer never had to answer to a board of directors or a government agency. He was the sole architect of his own dark kingdom. In 1968, James Marcus was appointed as the director of the Umbrella Executive Training Center in the Arklay Mountains. This was a turning point for the company's research, because it gave Marcus the isolation he needed to pursue his most radical ideas away from Spencer's direct supervision. While the training facility was officially used to develop the next generation of Umbrella leaders, its basement was where the real future was being built. Marcus was frustrated with the limitations of the raw Progenitor Virus. It was too lethal and too difficult to control in human hosts. He shifted his focus to finding a biological bridge, something that could stabilize the virus and make it more predictable. He chose leeches as his primary test subjects, drawn to their simple biology and their natural ability to survive in harsh conditions. He spent years obsessively merging the virus with Leech DNA, watching how the two organisms interacted. This period of research at the training facility was defined by Marcus's growing paranoia and his complete lack of ethical boundaries. He saw his students and subordinates as little more than biological data points. He wasn't just building a virus. He was building a cult of personality around his work. The training facility became a microcosm of the company's larger rot, where the pursuit of scientific breakthrough justified any level of cruelty. The results Marcus achieved during these months would eventually define the next 30 years of human history. He found the key to making the Progenitor Virus functional at a mass market level. Even though he was eventually cut off from his own work, the foundation he laid at the training facility was the blueprint for the global bioterror era. He was the one who turned a rare African flower into a product that could be manufactured and deployed. The facility's layout was designed to facilitate secret transport of subjects. Tunnels connected the main building to a water treatment plant, where waste and failed experiments could be disposed of without detection. This infrastructure allowed Marcus to operate with total impunity. By the time Spencer realized how far Marcus had gone, the T-virus was already a reality. In January of 1978, James Marcus finally achieved the breakthrough that Umbrella had been chasing for over a decade. By bonding the Progenitor Virus with Leech DNA, he created a stable variant that he named the Tyrant Virus, or the T-virus. This new strain was a significant departure from the original retrovirus. It was more infectious, more resilient, and crucially, it was capable of reanimating dead tissue. The T-virus solved the biggest problem with the progenitor strain, the high death rate of the host. By using the Leech DNA as a stabilizer, Marcus created a virus that could rewrite a host's biology without immediately destroying it. The virus would keep the body functional at a primal level while effectively destroying higher brain functions. The result was a host that was mindless, predatory, and driven by a constant need to consume and spread the infection. This prototype was the birth of the modern biological weapon. For the first time, Umbrella had a virus that could create an army that didn't need to be paid or managed. The T-virus turned the human body into a delivery system for itself. It was a self-replicating threat that could be introduced into a population and left to do its work. Marcus had created a biological engine with almost unlimited potential for modification and weaponization. The T-virus didn't just produce zombies, it produced a platform for future experimentation. Every creature Marcus infected with this new strain provided new data on how to accelerate mutation and control the results. It was the first time that the horror of the Arklay Mountains had a name and a functional structure. Marcus's work with the leeches had successfully bridged the gap between an ancient African mystery and a modern corporate weapon. The virus also exhibited an incredible ability to jump between species. Marcus noted that insects, mammals, and even plants could host the T-virus, often undergoing dramatic physical changes. This environmental persistence made the virus much more dangerous than a standard pathogen. It didn't just infect people, it infected the ecosystem itself. Part 8. The Human Problem. Why every non-human test subject led Marcus back to the same conclusion. As James Marcus perfected the T-virus on smaller organisms, he hit a biological wall when he tried to move the research toward human subjects. He found that while the virus worked with terrifying efficiency on arthropods and amphibians, the human response was unpredictable and inconsistent. This was the moment where the scientific challenge became a logistical nightmare. He realized that the genetic diversity of humans meant the virus wouldn't bond correctly with every host, leading to results that were often useless for a military application. Marcus discovered that a significant portion of the population possessed a natural immunity to the immediate effects of the virus. In these individuals, the infection would simply fail to take hold, or it would kill the host too quickly for the reanimation process to trigger. This resistance was a major hurdle for a company that wanted to sell a reliable weapon. If the T-virus couldn't guarantee a 100% infection rate, it wasn't the perfect tool for mass destruction that Spencer demanded. This realization led Marcus to a grim conclusion. He needed a massive supply of human material to find a way to break this natural resistance. He couldn't rely on animal data anymore because the human immune system was too complex. He needed to map how the virus interacted with different genetic markers across a wide range of subjects. This wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about brute force. He needed to see the virus fail 1,000 times to understand how to make it succeed once. The non-human subjects like leeches and insects were simple enough that the virus could rewrite their biology without destroying them. But humans were different. They were too complex, and their higher brain functions often collapsed before the virus could stabilize. This human problem defined Marcus's later years and drove him toward more extreme methods. He knew that the key to the ultimate biological weapon was hidden in the human genome, but it would require a mountain of corpses to find it. Marcus's research notes from this period show a man descending into a cold, clinical madness. He stopped seeing the subjects as living beings and started seeing them as containers for the virus. He documented the failures with a level of detachment that showed he'd lost any connection to the world outside his lab. Every failed injection was just another piece of data that brought him closer to the answer he craved. The final barrier was the human brain's ability to resist the viral rewriting process. Marcus found that the more intelligent a subject was, the more violently the brain reacted to the infection. This led to the complete mental collapse that created the mindless behavior seen in the later infected. He needed to find the balance between preserving the body and destroying the mind, a puzzle that would take years of illegal experimentation to solve. Part 9. Experimenting on trainees. The line. Marcus crossed and the cost. It had him. As Marcus grew more paranoid and desperate for results, the boundaries between research and murder began to disappear. He started looking at the Umbrella trainees and employees at the facility, not as the next generation of leadership, but as convenient test subjects. He began using them in his experiments, justifying the loss of life as a necessary sacrifice for the completion of the T-virus. This was the line that Marcus crossed, moving from sanctioned corporate research into a series of crimes that even Umbrella couldn't publicly defend. Marcus believed that the isolation of the training facility protected him, but he didn't realize that Spencer was watching his every move. Spencer saw these unauthorized human experiments not as a moral failure, but as a strategic liability. He viewed Marcus's increasing instability as a threat to the company's secrecy and his own control over the progenitor research. Marcus had become a loose cannon, and his obsession with the virus was making him easy to manipulate. The cost of this research was more than just the lives of the trainees. It was Marcus's own standing within the company. Spencer used these excesses as the perfect justification to move against his partner. By allowing Marcus to descend into this level of depravity, Spencer was able to paint him as an unhinged failure, while secretly preparing to steal the very results those experiments produced. The trainees died in the basement, and their deaths provided the leverage Spencer needed to consolidate his power. Marcus's final days at the facility were spent in a state of constant suspicion, yet he never saw the true threat coming from within his own circle. He believed his work made him indispensable, but to Spencer, Marcus was just a tool that had outlived its usefulness. The experiments on the trainees were the beginning of the end for the man who created the T-virus. He'd traded his humanity for a breakthrough, only to have it taken by the man who funded his descent. The training facility became a tomb for many young recruits who thought they were starting a career in pharmaceuticals. Instead, they were fed into Marcus's experiments, their files erased and their families told they died in accidents. This culture of secrecy and disposal was the true foundation of Umbrella's corporate identity. It's a reminder that the monsters in the games were always built on a foundation of human betrayal. Imagine being a trainee who realized the director wasn't training you, but was actually measuring your pulse for a different reason. The fear in that facility must have been thick enough to breathe. Marcus didn't care about the future of the company. He only cared about the future of his virus. He was willing to sacrifice every person under his command to see his vision reach its final form. Part 10. Birkin and Wesker take over. How Spencer had Marcus murdered and his research stolen. In 1978, Spencer finally closed the trap he'd been setting for a decade. He ordered a hit squad, led by two of Marcus's most promising protégés, William Birkin and Albert Wesker, to assassinate the director. They cornered Marcus in his laboratory and gunned him down, effectively ending the first era of T-virus development. It was a cold, professional execution that marked the rise of a new generation of Umbrella researchers who were even more ruthless than the founders. After the shooting, G. Marcus's body was dumped into the facility's waste treatment plant, left to rot among the discarded remains of his own experiments. Birkin and Wesker immediately seized all of Marcus's research data, including the stable T-virus prototype and his notes on the Leech experiments. They took the credit for the breakthrough, moving the project to the Arklay Research Center under Spencer's direct supervision. Marcus was erased from the company's official history, his work now the property of the men who killed him. This transition of power was a critical moment for the T-virus. Under Birkin's management, the focus shifted from pure biological research to refinement and mass production. Birkin was a prodigy who viewed Marcus's work as a rough draft that needed to be perfected. With the resources of the Arklay Lab behind him, he began to push the virus in directions Marcus never dreamed of, focused on creating something that could be deployed on a global scale. Wesker, meanwhile, focused on the tactical and strategic applications of the virus, using his position within the STARS team to monitor the research from the outside. They were a perfect team for Spencer's vision, one to build the monsters and one to manage the fallout. The death of James Marcus was the catalyst that turned the T-virus from a laboratory curiosity into a global industry. But even as they moved on, the remains of Marcus were being changed by the very leeches he'd spent his life creating. The waste treatment plant was supposed to be the end of the story, but the leeches had different plans. They swarmed Marcus's corpse, their biology merging with his cellular material over the next 20 years. This accidental fusion would eventually lead to the resurrection of Marcus, or at least a reconstruction of him that carried his memories and his hatred. Spencer thought he'd buried his past, but he'd actually just planted a seed that would eventually burn his company to the ground. Birkin and Wesker walked away from that basement as the new architects of Umbrella's future. They didn't feel guilt for what they'd done. They only felt the thrill of the resources they now controlled. They'd proven their loyalty to Spencer, and in return, they were given the keys to the most dangerous laboratory in the world. The era of the Founders was over, and the era of the modern bioweapon had begun. William Birkin was the golden child of the Umbrella Corporation. Recruited into the Wesker Project as a boy, he'd been groomed from a young age to be the future of biological warfare. When he took over Marcus's research in 1978, he didn't just want to continue the work, he wanted to surpass it in every measurable way. Birkin was driven by a level of competitive arrogance that made him the most dangerous man in the company's history. He viewed the T-virus as a raw, unrefined engine that lacked the precision needed for a truly modern weapon. Over the next decade, Birkin spent his time at the Arklay Research Center and the underground facility beneath Raccoon's city, dismantling the virus and rebuilding it. He wasn't interested in the philosophical goals of Spencer or the scientific curiosity of Marcus. He wanted results that could be manufactured, measured, and sold. Birkin's obsession with perfection meant that he was never satisfied with a single strain. He was constantly looking for ways to increase the infection rate and accelerate the mutation speed. He treated the human body as a biological puzzle, searching for the right combination of genetic traits that would allow the virus to achieve its full potential. His brilliance was undeniable, but it was entirely untethered from any sense of ethics or human empathy. By the late 1980s, Birkin had transformed the T-virus into a tool for mass production. He developed the manufacturing processes that would eventually allow Umbrella to deploy the virus across entire cities. He was the one who turned the Arklay facility into a factory of horror, producing the first reliable combat organisms. Birkin had inherited a legacy of death and turned it into a science, setting the stage for the final collapse of Raccoon City. His relationship with Albert Wesker was a partnership of convenience and shared ambition. While Birkin focused on the biology, Wesker focused on the data and the institutional power. They were two sides of the same coin, each using the other to advance their own standing within Umbrella. Birkin's lab was his kingdom, and he guarded his research with a level of paranoia that eventually rivaled Marcus's own. Birkin didn't care about the people his work would eventually kill. He only cared about the elegance of the viral sequence and the speed of the mutation. He was a man who lived in the numbers and the microscopic views of cellular ruin. To him, the T-virus was his greatest achievement, at least until he discovered something in the blood of a test subject that would make the T-virus look like child's play. Part 12. The Beta Strain. How Birkin combined T-virus with Ebola, DNA, and created the zombie. The most visible legacy of William Birkin's work is the creation of the Beta Strain. While the initial T-virus was stable, it still lacked the aggressive transmissibility needed for a weapon that could paralyze a modern city. Birkin solved this by combining the T-virus with elements from other lethal pathogens, most notably the Ebola virus. This mutation created a strain that was far more infectious and capable of spreading through fluid contact and even limited airborne exposure. This beta strain is what canonically produced the creature that would become synonymous with the Raccoon City incident, the zombie. By integrating the Ebola DNA, Birkin ensured that the virus would achieve a nearly 100% infection rate in non-immune subjects. A single bite was no longer just a wound. It was a guaranteed death sentence, followed by a predatory reanimation. The virus was now a self-sustaining wave of infection that could move through a population faster than any government could respond to it. The creation of the zombie wasn't an accident, it was a tactical choice. Birkin understood that a mindless, cannibalistic population was the ultimate way to overwhelm a city's infrastructure. It turned the civilians into the weapon, forcing the authorities to kill their own people just to survive. The beta strain was designed for maximum psychological and physical terror, making it the perfect product for Umbrella's military clients. Birkin's work on this strain also highlighted the horrifying physical changes the virus forced on the body. The flesh would begin to rot while the host was still alive, and the metabolism would shift to prioritize nothing but the consumption of fresh tissue. It was a biological dead end for the host, but a massive success for the company. The zombie was the first successful mass-market B.O.W.s, and it was the strain that would eventually bring the world's attention to the Arklay Mountains. The beta strain proved that the T-virus could be a societal eraser. It didn't just kill individuals, it killed the very idea of a functioning city. By the time the first symptoms appeared, the infection was usually already too widespread to contain. Birkin had created a virus that could decapitate a civilization without ever firing a shot, using nothing but the basic instincts of the people it infected. When you look at a zombie in the games, you're looking at Birkin's calculated refinement of Marcus's original work. It's a creature designed to be cheap, effective, and terrifying. The rot isn't just a side effect, it's a feature that ensures the host can't be saved and the infection can't be ignored. The beta strain was the moment the T-virus became a true global threat. Part 13. The Tyrant Project. The goal of building a single human biological weapon, controlled enough to follow orders. While the beta strain was effective for creating chaos, Spencer and Birkin still wanted a more precise instrument of war. They launched the Tyrant program with the goal of producing a single, perfect soldier, a human being who could survive full T-virus infection while retaining enough intelligence to follow complex tactical commands. They wanted a weapon that could be dropped into a combat zone, eliminate a specific target, and then be recovered for future use. The problem with the Tyrant program was genetic compatibility. Birkin realized that the specific genetic markers needed to produce a Tyrant without complete mental collapse were incredibly rare. estimated at only 1 in 10 million people. This meant that standard human subjects were almost always useless, producing only mindless mutations like the Hunter line. To build a Tyrant, they needed a very specific kind of human raw material, and they were willing to go to any lengths to find it. The early models, like the Tyrant Model 001 and the Tyrant Model 002, were the first successful results of this program. These creatures possessed incredible physical strength, regenerative abilities, and a basic level of tactical awareness. They were the ultimate proof of Birkin's theories, showing that the T-virus could be used to create something that wasn't just a monster, but a soldier. It was the crowning achievement of the Arklay Research Center. The Tyrant was designed to be the ultimate deterrent, a weapon that no conventional military could stand against. And they were the apex of Umbrella's biological engineering. Creatures that combined human intelligence with the unstoppable power of the Progenitor legacy. Every Tyrant produced was a testament to Birkin's skill and Spencer's ambition, representing a new era of warfare where the most dangerous thing on the battlefield was built in a lab. To solve the supply problem, Umbrella turned to more desperate measures. They started looking for children who might possess the right markers, grooming them in controlled environments like the Mediterranean island facility. They needed a generation of subjects who could handle the viral load without losing their minds. This search for the perfect subject was what drove much of the company's illegal activities in the years leading up to '98. The Tyrant Model 2 was the one that finally proved the concept was viable on a large scale. It was fast, powerful, and most importantly, it could be programmed. It was the monster that every STARS officer feared, a creature that could track a target through a ruined mansion without ever losing focus. The Tyrant was the realization of Spencer's God King fantasy, given flesh and a heartbeat. Part 14, Lisa Trevor, the test subject who survived everything and the accident, her body created. Lisa Trevor is perhaps the most tragic and significant figure in the history of the T-virus. The daughter of the architect who built the Spencer Mansion, she was abducted along with her mother in the 1960s and subjected to 30 years of continuous experimentation. Her body possessed a unique, resilient immune system that refused to die, no matter what Birkin and his predecessors threw at her. She became the ultimate black box for Umbrella's research. Over 3 decades, Lisa was infected with every major viral agent the company developed, including the raw Progenitor Virus, multiple T-virus strains, and eventually the NE-alpha parasite. Instead of dying or mutating into a standard B.O.W.s, her biology absorbed these pathogens, merging them into something entirely new. She became a walking laboratory, her cells evolving in real time to survive the constant torture of the experiments. Lisa was unkillable in the most literal sense. Her body was in a state of constant aggressive regeneration that defied the laws of biology. Birkin became obsessed with her, realizing that her cells had accomplished through sheer survival what he had been trying to achieve through science. She was the anchor for the entire Arklay facility, the one subject that never failed and never stopped producing data. The horror of Lisa Trevor's life was the price of Umbrella's most important discovery. She wasn't just a test subject. She was the source of the next stage of human evolution. Her suffering was the foundation upon which Birkin built his greatest work, and her existence was a secret that Spencer kept hidden from even his most trusted associates. She was the ghost of the mansion, a reminder of the human cost of the T-virus. Her mind was long gone, replaced by a single, obsessive need to find her mother. She lived in the tunnels beneath the mansion, wearing the skin of her victims in a horrific attempt to reconstruct her lost family. Umbrella didn't care about her pain. They only cared about the unique antibodies her blood produced. Every breakthrough Birkin made in the 80s could be traced back to a sample taken from Lisa's body. She was the ultimate survivor of a system that was designed to destroy her. Even the self-destruct system of the mansion couldn't truly end her story. Lisa Trevor was the living proof that the Progenitor Virus could create something that natural selection never intended. She was the anchor that held the entire Arklay Project together, a silent witness to 30 years of corporate evil. Part 15. The G-Virus Discovery. How Lisa's immune system accidentally produced something more dangerous than the T-Virus. In 1988, the years of experimenting on Lisa Trevor finally produced a breakthrough that would change the course of Birkin's career. While monitoring her cellular data, Birkin discovered that Lisa's body had spontaneously mutated a completely new viral strain, the G-Virus, or the Golgotha virus. Unlike the T-Virus, which caused the host to stagnate and rot, the G-Virus was an agent of uncontrolled, rapid evolution. The G-Virus didn't just reanimate the dead. It forced the living body to keep changing, rebuilding itself in response to damage or environmental stress. It was a virus that sought to create a G-organism, a creature that would never stop evolving until it reached a state of biological perfection. This discovery was so significant that Birkin immediately shifted his focus away from the T-Virus project and toward this new, more dangerous agent. Birkin realized that the G-Virus was the key to true immortality and limitless power, things that even the T-Virus couldn't offer. He moved his research to the Nest facility beneath Raccoon City, working in secret to stabilize the G project for human use. The G-Virus was the accidental child of Lisa Trevor's suffering, a mutation that Birkin believed would finally allow him to step out of the shadow of his predecessors. The discovery of the G-Virus marked the beginning of Birkin's defection from Spencer's vision. He started to view the virus as his personal property, something too valuable to be shared with a company that he felt had held him back. The G-Virus was the point of no return for Birkin, leading directly to the betrayal and the outbreak that would eventually burn Raccoon City to the ground. It was the ultimate biological weapon, and it started in the blood of a girl who refused to die. The way the G-Virus interacted with the host was fundamentally different from the T-Virus. While the T-Virus took away the mind to preserve the body, the G-Virus hijacked the host's entire reproductive system to ensure its own survival. It sought to pass on its genetic material through implantation, creating offspring that carried the same evolutionary drive. It wasn't just a disease, it was a new branch on the tree of life. Birkin saw himself as the god of this new branch. He believed that with the G-Virus, he could bypass the limitations of human biology and create something that would outlast Umbrella itself. He became protective of the samples, hiding them from Wesker and Spencer as his paranoia grew. The G-Virus was his masterpiece, and he was willing to destroy everything he'd built to keep it for himself. The Arklay Research Center, hidden within the Spencer Mansion, was the primary site for the development of the T-Virus for over 20 years. It was a state-of-the-art facility designed for both research and containment. But by May of 1998, its walls were starting to fail. A viral leak, later confirmed to have been engineered by the resurrected James Marcus, allowed the T-Virus to spread through the ventilation system and into the surrounding forest. Spencer's response to this leak was not to contain it, but to exploit it. He deliberately allowed the facility to collapse and the infection to spread among the staff. He saw the disaster as a live combat scenario, a perfect opportunity to see how his B.O.W.s would perform in a real-world environment. He wanted to gather final data on the virus's efficiency as a weapon of terror before he moved on to the next phase of his plans. The researchers and security staff in the mansion were treated as disposable assets, as they turned into zombies and were hunted by the very creatures they'd helped build. Umbrella sat back and recorded the results. The mansion became a slaughterhouse, a closed ecosystem of horror, where every death provided a new data point for the company's files. It was the ultimate expression of corporate coldness. The deliberate collapse of the Arklay Lab was the final test for the T-virus. It proved that the virus could decapitate an organization from within and turn a secure facility into a death trap in a matter of days. Spencer was finished with the mansion, and he was willing to burn everyone inside it to ensure that the data he collected was worth the cost. The STARS team was about to walk into a trap that had been set months in advance. The infection spread to the surrounding Arklay Mountains, affecting the local wildlife and creating reports of strange disappearances and cannibalistic murders. These reports were exactly what Spencer needed to lure the police into the area. He wanted the best soldiers in Raccoon City to go up against his creations so he could see which ones were truly worth mass-producing. The mansion was no longer a lab, it was an arena. By the time Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine arrived, the mansion was already a ruin. The staff were either dead or transformed, and the B.O.W.s were roaming the halls freely. Spencer's data collection was already well underway, monitored remotely by Wesker. The entire incident was a calculated sacrifice of years of research, all to prove that the T-virus was ready for the global stage. Part 17. The T-virus release in the Arklay Mountains. What happened when Umbrella let the infection spread to gather combat data? The leak at the Arklay Research Center wasn't just a failure of safety protocols. It was a transition from theory to practice. As the T-virus seeped into the facility's ventilation system in May of 1998, it didn't just target the scientists in their white coats. It moved into the surrounding forest, infecting the local wildlife and creating a perimeter of biological hazards that even the local police couldn't explain. This wasn't an accident that caught Oswald Spencer by surprise. Instead, he saw the containment breach as a perfect opportunity to monitor the virus in a live environment. He wanted to see how his investments performed when the sterile environment of the lab was replaced by the chaotic reality of a forest. The researchers who had spent decades building the T-virus became its first real-world data points. As the infection took hold, the staff descended into the primal, cannibalistic state that Birkin had engineered into the beta strain. They barricaded themselves in rooms that became their tombs, writing final notes as their higher brain functions dissolved into nothingness. Umbrella didn't send a rescue team because a rescue team would have ruined the experiment. They needed to see the full progression of the rot. They needed to know exactly how long a facility could hold out once the air itself became a weapon. Outside the mansion walls, then the infection was rewriting the local ecosystem with terrifying speed. The T-virus jumped to the crows, the dogs, and even the insects, creating the first sightings of what the locals called monsters. This environmental spread was a calculated risk that provided Umbrella with invaluable data on how the virus could terraform a region. They watched as the forest became a natural barrier, a place where no one could enter or leave without facing a biological predator. This verified that the T-virus wasn't just a disease for humans. It was a tool for complete environmental denial. Every death in the Arklay Mountains was recorded by hidden sensors and remote cameras that Spencer had installed throughout the region. He wasn't just looking for kills. He was looking for the breakdown of institutional order. He wanted to see how fast the police would fail and how long it would take for the public to realize they were being hunted. The Arklay incident proved that the T-virus could decapitate a high-security facility from the inside out. It was a successful audit of corporate cruelty that paved the way for the ultimate test in Raccoon City. By the time the investigation eventually started, the mansion was no longer a laboratory. It was a showroom for biological warfare. The silence of the forest was the only proof of the virus's efficiency. Spencer had seen enough to know that his vision was functional. The staff was dead, the forest was poisoned, and the data was secure. It was a cold, clinical success that cost hundreds of lives and millions of dollars in equipment. But to Umbrella, that was just the cost of doing business. Part 18, Stars and the Mansion. Incident, what Wesker was actually sent. There to do, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, were never intended to be the heroes of the Arklay incident. To Albert Wesker, his team was nothing more than high-end laboratory equipment. Wesker was a double agent who had been playing both sides for years, and he saw the mansion investigation as the final piece of his personal exit strategy. He led Alpha Team into the mountains with a single goal: to gather live combat data. He needed to see how the most elite tactical officers in the country would fare against the B.O.W.s that Umbrella had been building in secret. Wesker's betrayal was calculated down to the minute. He sent Bravo Team in first to test the soft targets of the mansion, watching from the safety of the perimeter as his colleagues were torn apart by the infected wildlife. When he finally brought Alpha Team in, he wasn't there to find survivors. He was there to observe. He wanted to see how Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine handled a hunter or a tyrant in a real firefight. Every bullet they fired and every tactic they used was a measurement of the B.O.W.s effectiveness against top-tier human opposition. The data Wesker collected that night was worth more than his career in law enforcement. He intended to use the combat records to sell his services and the T-virus samples to Umbrella's rivals. He believed that the STARS officers were the ultimate benchmark. If a creature could kill a STARS officer, it could kill anyone. This was the dark reality of the mansion. The officers weren't there to stop a crime. They were there to validate a product. Wesker was a researcher first and a captain second, and he didn't care about the bodies he left behind. As the night progressed, Wesker's plan shifted toward his own biological ascension. He'd been working with Birkin on a specific variant of the virus that he intended to use on himself. He needed the mansion to burn and his team to die so that he could disappear into the shadows as something more than human. The STARS survivors were an anomaly he hadn't fully accounted for, but their survival actually provided him with even better data. Their resilience showed him the limits of the Tyrant Model 002 and the potential for a human to resist the viral rewriting. The destruction of the mansion was the ultimate cover-up. Wesker triggered the self-destruct sequence not to stop the virus, but to erase his fingerprints. He walked away from the explosion with a hard drive full of data and a body full of experimental potential. The survivors were left with a trauma they couldn't explain and a report that no one would believe. Wesker had used the Special Tactics and Rescue Service to buy his way into a new life, leaving the ruins of the mansion as a testament to his ambition. Part 19. The B.O.W.s of the mansion. Everything the T-virus had produced by 1998, under one roof. The Spencer Mansion was a living catalogue of biological failure and success. By 1998, It held every major creation that Marcus and Birkin had ever developed. The most common creatures were the zombies, the byproduct of the beta strain that had turned the researchers into mindless cannibals. These were the baseline, the proof that the T-virus could reliably reanimate dead tissue and create a persistent threat. But the mansion also housed the more advanced Hunter Alpha line, creatures built by injecting fertilized human eggs with the virus to create a fast, lethal, and tactical predator. The facility also showcased the accidental horrors of the T-virus's environmental adaptability. There was the Neptune, a great white shark that proved the virus could weaponize the water, and the web spinners, which showed how the virus could enhance the natural traits of arachnids to create a territorial nightmare. These creatures weren't always designed for war, but they provided Umbrella with the data needed to understand how the virus would interact with different ecosystems. The mansion was a theater where every room held a different version of biological ruin. At the center of this collection was the Tyrant Model 002. This was the peak of the T-virus program at the time, a creature that combined massive physical power with a basic level of programming. It was designed to be the ultimate soldier, a weapon that could be dropped into a city and clear it of all life. The Tyrant represented the moment the T-virus stopped being a research project and started being a military asset. Its presence in the mansion was the final proof that Birkin had surpassed Marcus's original vision. It was a god of a new world, built from the stolen DNA of thousands of subjects. The mansion also contained the chimeras, horrifying hybrids of human and insect DNA that were deemed too unstable for mass production. These creatures roamed the dark corners of the facility, hunting by heat and sound, and every creature in the mansion was a chapter in Umbrella's history. There were Cerberus dogs that could outrun any car, and a massive snake known as Yawn that had grown to impossible sizes. The T-virus had rewritten the hierarchy of nature within the Arklay Mountains, placing these engineered monsters at the very top. The containment of these B.O.W.s was failing long before the STARS team arrived. The mansion was filled with cages and reinforced glass that had been shattered by the creature's newfound strength. This demonstrated one of the biggest flaws in the program. The creatures often became too powerful to control. This volatility was something Umbrella viewed as a metric to be studied, rather than a failure to be corrected. They believed that with enough data, they could eventually leash the monsters they had birthed. By late 1998, William Birkin's relationship with Umbrella had dissolved into a mess of paranoia and ego. He'd spent a decade building the G-virus in his secret lab beneath Raccoon City, and he started to believe that the company didn't deserve his masterpiece. Birkin saw the G-virus as his personal property, a discovery so profound that it should belong to him alone. He began secret negotiations with high-ranking officials in the United States military, offering them the G-virus in exchange for asylum and the funding to keep working without Spencer's interference. Birkin moved his entire operation into the Nest facility, a massive laboratory he designed to be his personal fortress. He believed that his control over Chief Irons and the local police would protect him from corporate retaliation. He spent his days refining the G-virus, preparing to hand it over to the government and disappear. He wanted to be the architect of a new era of warfare, one where he held the ultimate power over life and death. His defection wasn't about saving lives. It was about ensuring his own godhood. Umbrella's intelligence network was too deep for Birkin to hide his plans. Spencer realized that his golden child was planning to walk away with the most valuable biological discovery in the company's history. This was a threat that couldn't be ignored. If the G virus fell into government hands, Umbrella's monopoly would be over. Spencer ordered the Umbrella Security Service, a specialized paramilitary unit, to recover the samples and eliminate Birkin. The mission was called Operation Nest, and it was a cold move to reclaim corporate property. The conflict between Birkin and Umbrella reflected the rot at the heart of the whole company. The leaders weren't fighting for a vision anymore. They were fighting over the spoils of their own corruption. Birkin's defection was the final crack in the foundation Spencer had built. It proved that the men who built the monsters were becoming monsters themselves, driven by greed and a god complex that couldn't be contained. The Nest facility was now the front line of a corporate civil war that would eventually spill over into the streets of Raccoon City. Birkin's preparations for the transfer were almost finished when the Umbrella Security Service squad, led by Hunk, arrived in the sewers. He was cornered in his lab and refused to surrender his work. The unit followed orders and opened fire, leaving Birkin for dead in a pool of his own blood. They seized the virus samples and headed out, thinking the mission was a success. They hadn't accounted for Birkin's desperation. As he lay dying, he reached for the only thing that could save him: the final vial of the G virus. Part 21. The Umbrella Security Service attack and the infected rats. How the T virus got into Raccoon City's water supply. The failure of the Umbrella Security Service mission to cleanly recover the G virus was the moment Raccoon City's fate was sealed. As the dying William Birkin injected himself with the G virus, he underwent a horrific transformation, becoming a massive G organism that hunted down the squad in the sewers. During the struggle, several vials of the T virus were crushed under the weight of the fighters. The concentrated viral liquids leaked into the stagnant water of the city's sewer system, a network that connected the laboratory directly to the civilian world above. This leak was the beginning of an invisible disaster. The sewer rats immediately began to consume the viral-laced water and the remains of the dead unit members. These rats became the primary vectors for the infection, carrying the T virus into the city's water filtration systems and through the walls of homes and businesses. The virus wasn't being spread by a bite or an airborne cloud yet. It was moving through the very pipes that the people relied on for life. It was an environmental decapitation that no one saw coming. The rats didn't just carry the virus, they were changed by it. They became more aggressive and started to bite everything they encountered. As they emerged from the drains, they brought the T virus into direct contact with the human population. The infection began as a series of strange illnesses that the local hospitals couldn't explain. By the time the authorities realized they were dealing with an outbreak, the T virus had already achieved a critical mass within the water supply. Every glass of water was now a potential source of infection. Raccoon City's geography made it the perfect incubator for the T virus. The city was isolated in the mountains, with a centralized water system and a dense urban core. Once the rats had distributed the virus, the multiplier effect took over. The infected humans began to bite others, and the infection moved from the sewers to the streets in days. The unit attack had turned into a biological carpet bombing of a major city. Hunk was the only survivor of the squad, the one man who watched as the world he helped build began to dissolve into chaos. Umbrella's response to the leak was to double down on their secrecy. They knew exactly what had happened, but they chose to let the infection spread while they prepared their cleanup assets. They wanted to see how the refined Epsilon strain would handle a population of 100,000 people. They used the sewers as a natural petri dish, monitoring the rats and the initial human cases to refine their data. The tragedy of Raccoon City wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of a philosophy that viewed a city as a disposable resource. Part 22, September 1998. The outbreak day by day and how fast the city fell. The fall of Raccoon City in September of 1998 was a masterclass in societal collapse. It began on September 24th, during a football game at the stadium where the first major public outbreaks occurred. The T-virus had reached a tipping point. Dozens of people suddenly became violent, and the police department found itself fighting a war without a clear enemy. By the 25th, a state of emergency was declared, but the infection was moving faster than any government response. The police department was systematically dismantled from within by a compromised Chief Irons. He deliberately sabotaged the response, hiding ammunition and cutting off communication to ensure the city would fall. He wanted to see the chaos unfold. By September 26th, the hospital was overrun and the streets were filled with the shambling dead. The civilian population tried to flee, only to find the bridges barricaded and the outskirts patrolled by Umbrella's sanitization teams. By September 27th and 28th, the city had stopped being a city and had become a slaughterhouse. The sounds of gunfire were replaced by the sounds of the infected. The T-virus was now spreading through direct contact. The infrastructure failed, power went down, the water stopped running, and a media blackout ensured the outside world knew nothing. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield arrived on the 29th, driving into a nightmare that was already in its final stage. The speed of the collapse surprised even Umbrella. They had estimated it would take weeks, but the T-virus accomplished it in less than 7 days. The zombie wave was unstoppable because it utilized the city's density. Every dead citizen became a new soldier for the virus. By the 30th, the police station had fallen, and the only survivors were those hiding in the deepest shadows. The city was a live fire range for the company's latest B.O.W.s, proving they could erase a city from the map using nothing but a needle and a lie. Part 23. The Epsilon Strain, the refined T-virus, spreading through Raccoon City and what made it different. The version of the T-virus that destroyed Raccoon City was the Epsilon Strain. It was a highly refined and aggressive variant developed by William Birkin specifically for maximum lethality. This strain was designed to overcome the immunity gap that had plagued earlier versions. It was faster to take hold, harder to treat, and produced a more durable host. The zombies in the city were stronger and more persistent than those in the mansion, because the Epsilon strain was fueling their tissue with a more efficient metabolic process. What made the Epsilon strain unique was its long-term biological footprint. While it was designed to turn the population into zombies, it was also built with a dormancy feature. In about 10% of the population who had a natural resistance, the virus wouldn't cause immediate reanimation. Instead, it would enter a state of vascular dormancy, hiding in the system and waiting for the immune system to weaken. This was a fail-safe Birkin had designed to ensure that even if the initial outbreak failed, the virus would remain in the population for decades. The Epsilon strain also had a higher rate of secondary mutation. This led to the emergence of the lickers, humans who had undergone a second, more violent transformation. The virus would continue to rewrite the DNA of the zombie, stripping away the skin and enhancing the muscular structure. This V-ACT process proved that the Epsilon Strain was never finished with its host. It would keep pushing the biology until the subject became the ultimate predator or collapsed under its own mutation. Raccoon City was the only place where the Epsilon Strain was ever released at this scale. This gave Umbrella a unique dataset on how a biological weapon interacts with a diverse population. They saw how the strain adapted to different ages and environments. The Epsilon zombies were a biological achievement, their nervous systems rewritten to ignore everything but the drive to feed. It was the standardized version of horror that Birkin had always dreamed of creating, a virus that didn't just kill the present but haunted the future. Part 24. The Tyrants Deployed. Every Bio umbrella sent into the city and what each one was testing. Raccoon City was a proving ground for Umbrella's most expensive military assets. As the city fell, the company deployed multiple Tyrant units to test their effectiveness in an urban environment. The most famous was the Nemesis T-type, a Tyrant model 002 that had been infected with the NE alpha parasite. This creature was sent specifically to hunt down the remaining STARS members. It was a test of tactical persistence. Umbrella wanted to see if a B.O.W. could track and eliminate specific targets while ignoring collateral civilian presence. Alongside the Nemesis, Umbrella deployed several Tyrant Model 103 units, commonly known as the Mr. X models. These Tyrants were dropped into the police station and other key locations to recover G-virus samples and eliminate witnesses. These units were a test of objective-based programming. Unlike the mindless zombies, the Mr. X models could follow specific orders and navigate complex buildings. They represented the soldier tier of the T-virus program, showing that the company could produce a reliable, mass-producible combatant. The deployment of these Tyrants was monitored by Umbrella's satellite network, providing real-time data on their performance. They also released other experimental B.O.W.s, like the Gravedigger and various hunter models, to see how different creatures would interact in a shared territory. The city became a biological Royal Rumble, where the different strains were forced to compete for dominance. This allowed Umbrella to see which B.O.W.s were the most cost-effective for a military contract. The Nemesis was a massive leap forward. The integration of the parasite allowed for a higher level of intelligence and the ability to use weaponry, like rocket launchers. It proved that the T-virus could be guided by a secondary organism, solving the control problems that had plagued earlier models. The Nemesis was the ultimate proof of concept for the future of warfare. A weapon as smart as a human, but as unstoppable as a machine. Its presence in Raccoon City was the final exam for the entire Arklay Project. Part 25, October 1st. The thermobaric strike and what the government was actually trying to bury. By the morning of October 1st, 1998, Raccoon City had ceased to be a place of human habitation. The streets were choked with the remains of the 100,000 people who once lived there, and the T-virus had successfully turned every alleyway into a biological death trap. The United States government, realizing that the quarantine perimeter was failing and the infection was too aggressive to contain, authorized Mission Code XX. A thermobaric missile was launched with the official purpose of sanitizing the area. This weapon was designed to create a massive heatwave that would vaporize organic matter, ensuring that no trace of the T-virus or the G-virus could escape into the surrounding Midwestern region. It was a cold, clinical solution to a problem that had grown beyond the reach of conventional military force. However, the strike wasn't just an act of public safety. It was a calculated move to destroy the evidence of a decades-long relationship between the government and the Umbrella Corporation. Raccoon's city was a goldmine of incriminating documents, including illegal contracts, shared research files, and proof of government-funded bioweapons programs. By leveling the city, the people in power were effectively burning the receipt for their own crimes. They wanted the world to see a tragedy caused by a corporate accident, rather than a systematic failure of institutional oversight. The intense heat of the blast ensured that every hard drive, every test subject, and every witness within the blast zone was erased in a single moment of white light. The decision to authorize the strike was made in a frantic, classified session that most of the country would never hear about. The president was presented with a map showing the projected spread of the Epsilon Strain, and the numbers were undeniable. If the city wasn't cauterized, the infection would reach the national interstate system within 48 hours. The thermobaric missile was the only tool powerful enough to handle a biological hazard of this scale, providing a level of heat that no viral strain could survive. When the missile struck at dawn, the sky over Raccoon City turned a blinding, artificial white. The explosion was so powerful that it registered on seismographs across the state, marking the literal end of a community. The survivors who managed to escape just before the blast, just including Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, watched the horizon glow with a terrible, silent light. They knew that what was being buried wasn't just the monsters, but the documented truth of how those monsters were built. The government's narrative immediately shifted to a chemical spill, a story they hoped would satisfy the public and the international community. But the fallout of Raccoon City couldn't be contained by a single missile, no matter how hot it burned. The data had already been copied, the samples had already been moved, and the ghosts of the city would haunt the world for the next 30 years. The strike was a conclusion for the city, but it was just the prologue for the global era of bioterrorism. It proved that the government was willing to sacrifice 100,000 citizens to protect its own secrets. The crater left behind became a silent witness to the cost of corporate ambition. Raccoon City was gone, but the T-virus was now a part of the global consciousness. The strike hadn't killed the problem. It had simply removed the evidence. As the dust settled over the Midwestern ruins, the survivors realized that the war was only just beginning, and the enemy was much larger than a single pharmaceutical company. This act of sanitization created a vacuum that other organizations were eager to fill. The disappearance of the city meant that the black market value of any remaining T-virus samples skyrocketed. The government had tried to cauterize the wound, but they'd actually just scattered the infection. The strike was the ultimate expression of institutional cowardice, a moment where the people in power decided that murder was easier than accountability. Raccoon City died twice that night, once from the virus and once from the response to it. The white light of the explosion was the final mask for a decades-long conspiracy that was now entering its most dangerous phase. The destruction of Raccoon City was the beginning of a slow, agonizing death for the Umbrella Corporation. While the company used its massive legal and political influence to delay the inevitable, the evidence gathered by survivors and whistleblowers was too significant to ignore. The Arklay incident and the subsequent fall of the city had pulled back the curtain on 30 years of illegal research. Umbrella's stock plummeted as investors realized the company's household products were just a mask for a global bioweapons factory. By 2003, the legal battles reached a tipping point. and the company was officially dismantled by a series of international tribunals. It's a reminder that even the largest institutions can't survive the truth once it's fully unleashed. Umbrella's collapse wasn't just a financial event. It was a fragmentation of a dark empire. As the company was liquidated, its assets were seized, and its executives were prosecuted. However, the most dangerous assets weren't the buildings or the bank accounts. The most dangerous assets were the viral samples and the research data stored in hidden servers around the world. As the corporate structure dissolved, these samples began to disappear into the hands of rival companies and black market networks. The monster that Spencer had built had outlasted its master, and its parts were now being sold to the highest bidder in a global fire sale of biological horror. The fall of the company created a power vacuum in the world of biological research. Organizations that had once lived in Umbrella's shadow suddenly had access to the T-virus and its many variants. This led to the global bioterror era, where the weapons once guarded by Spencer's private army were now being used in civil wars and terrorist attacks across the globe. The collapse of the institution didn't end the threat. It simply removed the leash. The world realized too late that Umbrella had been the only entity capable of containing its own creations. And without them, the T-virus was a free agent. It was a corporate death that birthed 1,000 smaller nightmares. Oswell Spencer went into hiding during the collapse, retreating to his estate in Europe to watch his vision crumble. He'd spent his life building a God-King dynasty, only to see it end in a crowded courtroom. Yet, even in the ruins of his company, he was still looking for a way to finish his work. The collapse of Umbrella was a victory for justice, but it was a disaster for global security. It turned a centralized threat into a decentralized one, ensuring that the legacy of the Progenitor Virus would continue to evolve under new names and new banners for decades to come. The logo was gone, but the rot stayed in the soil. The dissolution of the company also meant that the thousands of employees who knew the secrets were suddenly unemployed and desperate. Many of them took their research with them, selling out to the highest bidder just to survive. This brain drain was what fueled the next 20 years of bioterrorism. The researchers who built the Tyrant Model 103 were now building monsters for terrorist groups. It's the ultimate irony of Umbrella's end. The company died, but its employees ensured that its work would live forever. The institutional knowledge of how to end the world was now a distributed network of freelance scientists. The legal proceedings lasted for years, but they never truly addressed the root of the problem. They focused on the finances and the local failures, but they couldn't prosecute the virus itself. Umbrella had been a shield for the founders' true intentions, and once that shield was gone, the world was left staring at a biological abyss. The collapse proved that no company is too big to fail, but it also proved that some failures are too large to contain. Umbrella's death was the starting gun for a new kind of war, where the enemy didn't have a headquarters or a public face. The world was now a laboratory, and everyone was a subject. Part 27. The Black Market. How T-virus strains escaped into the world. After Umbrella fell. Once the Umbrella Corporation was no longer a legal entity, the T-virus became the most valuable commodity on the global black market. Disgruntled former employees, seeing their careers ended by the collapse, walked away from laboratories with vials of the Epsilon Strain tucked into their pockets. These samples were sold to shadow organizations, rogue states, and rival pharmaceutical giants who were eager to close the gap in their own biological research. The T-virus was no longer a corporate secret. It was a currency. This led to a surge in localized outbreaks in developing nations, where the virus was used as a cheap and effective way to clear territory or destabilize a government. The black market for B.O.W.s was a sophisticated network that operated in the spaces between international law. Strains of the virus were traded for weapons, data, and political influence. This era saw the rise of new players who took Umbrella's rough designs and refined them for the modern battlefield. They didn't have the grand eugenics vision of Spencer, but they had the cold efficiency of the marketplace. They understood that the T-virus was a product, and like any product, it needed to be improved to stay competitive. This led to the creation of hybrid strains that were even more resilient than the versions seen in Raccoon City, designed for specific climates and combat scenarios. The spread of the virus meant that the horror of the Arklay Mountains was now being repeated in Africa, Eastern Europe, and South America. Small villages were wiped out by experimental releases, and the survivors were often left to deal with the biological fallout alone. The T-virus had become a permanent part of the global landscape, a ghost that could reappear in any city at any time. The black market ensured that the research Birkin and Marcus had done would never be truly lost. It was a digital and biological archive of human cruelty, accessible to anyone with enough money and a lack of conscience. It turned the world into a series of disconnected petri dishes. This period of proliferation was what forced the creation of international task forces like the BSAA. The world's governments realized they were fighting a war that had no borders and no clear front line. Every time they shut down a laboratory, 2 more appeared in a different country. The T-virus had become a hydra, growing new heads faster than they could be cut off. The legacy of the 1966 expedition had successfully poisoned the entire world, turning the Progenitor Virus into a global pandemic of manufactured terror. It wasn't about one company anymore. It was about an entire industry that viewed human life as a raw material. The black market didn't just sell the virus, it sold the instructions on how to use it. Blueprints for facilities, tactical manuals for deploying B.O.W.s, and genetic maps were all available for the right price. This democratization of bioterrorism meant that even small groups could now threaten major powers. The T-virus was the ultimate equalizer, a weapon that didn't require a nuclear silo or a long-range missile. It just required a vial and a delivery system. The world was now living in the shadow of a market that prioritized the death of the many for the profit of the few. It's a dark economy that continues to thrive in the ruins of Umbrella's legacy. Imagine the reality of a world where a biological apocalypse is just a transaction away. The black market turned the T-virus into a permanent threat that can't be reasoned with or bargained away. It's a constant, low-level hum of dread that defines the modern era. The survivors of Raccoon City watched as the thing that destroyed their home was packaged and sold like a common drug. It was the final insult to the victims, proving that the world had learned nothing from the tragedy except how to profit from it. The T-virus was the original product, and the black market ensured it would never go out of style. Part 28. The V-ACT Strain and the Crimson Heads. The mutation nobody fully understood until it was too late. One of the most terrifying discoveries of the post-Umbrella era was the full understanding of the V-ACT process. During the Mansion incident, STARS officers had encountered zombies that, after being incapacitated, underwent a second mutation into what became known as Crimson Heads. These creatures were faster, more aggressive, and possessed long, sharp claws. At the time, it was thought to be a rare fluke of the T virus, but later research confirmed that the V-ACT was a deliberate feature of the virus's design. It was a secondary activation protocol that triggered when the host's body suffered significant trauma, forcing the virus to rapidly rewrite the tissue to ensure the host's survival. The V-ACT strain proved that the T virus was never finished with a host. Even when a zombie appeared to be dead, the virus was still working in the dark, rebuilding the muscular structure and increasing the metabolic rate. The Crimson Head was the result of the virus prioritizing combat efficiency over long-term stability. This discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community, because it meant that the shambling dead were just a pupal stage. If left alone, a zombie could eventually become something much worse. The V-ACT was the virus's way of adapting to resistance, ensuring that even a wounded predator could still kill its prey. This mutation was particularly difficult to manage in large-scale outbreaks. It meant that every body had to be thoroughly destroyed or incinerated to prevent a second wave of more lethal creatures. In Raccoon City, the Epsilon Strain had been designed to accelerate this process, leading to the rapid emergence of lickers. The V-ACT was the bridge between a human host and a true B.O.W. It was the moment where the biology stopped trying to mimic life and started focusing entirely on slaughter. The Crimson Head was the first warning that the T virus had layers of horror that Umbrella had only begun to peel back in their secret files. The realization that the virus could reactivate in a dead body was a massive psychological blow to the survivors. It meant there was no such thing as a safe room as long as a corpse was nearby. The V-ACT strain was a masterpiece of biological persistence, a failsafe that kept the infection moving even after the heart stopped beating. It was a reminder that the T virus was an active, malignant intelligence, a piece of ancient RNA that refused to be silenced by a bullet. The Crimson Heads were the heralds of a more violent future, one where the monsters would keep evolving until there was nothing left to hunt. The V-ACT also showed how the T virus could manipulate the host's nervous system to ignore pain and fatigue. A Crimson Head wouldn't stop until its brain was destroyed, its body fueled by an aggressive viral metabolism that burned through cellular energy at an impossible rate. This made them short-lived, but incredibly dangerous. It's a biological sprint designed to eliminate a threat before the host finally collapses. Umbrella documented this as a successful test of tactical recovery, viewing the V-ACT as a way to ensure that even a failed infection could still provide a lethal result for the enemy. When STARS first encountered these creatures, they didn't have the terminology to describe them. They just knew that the dead were getting back up stronger than before. This tactical surprise was exactly what Birkin had intended. The V-ACT ensures that the battlefield is never truly clear. It forces the opposition to spend time and resources on disposal, slowing down any counteroffensive. It's a virus that plays the long game, using the bodies of its victims as a secondary weapon. The Crimson Head is the perfect symbol of the T virus, a relentless, evolving threat that refuses to stay down. Part 29. The Rockfort Strain, the Airborne Variant and what it represented as a next step. The Rockford Island incident introduced a new and even more dangerous variant of the T virus. This strain was a byproduct of the Ashford family's research, specifically focused on environmental contamination and airborne transmission. Unlike the strains in Raccoon City that required fluid contact or ingestion, the Rockfort variant could linger in the air for extended periods, making gas masks the only way to survive. This represented a massive leap forward in the virus's effectiveness as a weapon of mass destruction. It turned an entire island into a gas chamber in a matter of hours, showing that the T-virus could be used to clear a target without ever needing a single bite. The Rockfort strain was also notable for how it interacted with the T. veronica virus developed by Alexia Ashford. This fusion of technologies showed that the T-virus could act as a delivery system for even more exotic and lethal pathogens. It was a platform for biological experimentation that the Ashford family had used to create their own private nightmare. The airborne nature of the virus meant that a single breach in a facility's containment could result in the total infection of a base or a ship. This was the ultimate realization of the virus's potential to deny an enemy any safe ground, creating a lethal atmosphere that stayed active for days. This variant proved that the T-virus was still evolving long after Birkin's death. The researchers at Rockfort had taken the baseline and added a layer of environmental persistence that made it a perfect tool for a scorched earth policy. When the island fell, the airborne virus ensured that every living thing, from the soldiers in the barracks to the birds in the sky, was brought under the virus's control. It was a cold, efficient demonstration of what a modern, refined T-virus could accomplish. But the Rockfort strain was the version of the virus that the military had always wanted. A weapon that could be dropped from the sky and leave nothing but silence behind. The survivors of Rockfort, including Claire Redfield, had to deal with a threat that was invisible and omnipresent. It changed the nature of the survival horror, making the very air a source of dread. This variant was later sold on the black market, appearing in various bioterror events throughout the early 2000s. It became a favorite of groups who wanted to maximize casualties with minimal effort. The Rockfort strain was the final proof that the T-virus had moved beyond the limits of the human host and had become an environmental catastrophe that could be unleashed with the turn of a valve. The Ashfords used this variant to maintain their own isolation, turning their island into a place where no one could land without their permission. It was a biological moat, a defense system that didn't require soldiers or walls. The airborne T-virus was the ultimate expression of the family's arrogance, believing they could control the very air around them. But like all of Umbrella's creations, it eventually turned on them. When the containment was breached, the island became a tomb for the very people who had built it. The Rockfort strain showed that once you poison the air, there's no going back. The research data from Rockfort was later recovered and used to develop even more sophisticated delivery systems. It proved that the T-virus could be stabilized in a gaseous form without losing its infectious potency. And this opened the door for the development of viral bombs and aerosol dispensers that could infect an entire city block in seconds. The Rockfort variant was the bridge between the urban chaos of Raccoon City and the clinical, systematic warfare of the later years. It was a silent killer that turned the act of breathing into a gamble. The missile strike on Raccoon City was supposed to be the end of the T-virus story, but the biology proved more resilient than the government's missiles. About 10% of the city's population possessed a natural genetic resistance that prevented them from turning into zombies during the initial outbreak. Some of these individuals managed to escape the city before the strike, carrying a dormant version of the Epsilon Strain in their blood. They were the walking legacies of BIRKIN'S greatest work. Survivors who thought they were clean, but were actually carrying a ticking time bomb within their own genetic code. It's a reminder that some debts are never truly paid. These survivors were monitored by various government agencies and private organizations for years. They were the source of the data that would eventually lead to the discovery of Raccoon City Syndrome. Because the Epsilon strain was designed for persistence, it didn't just disappear after the host recovered from the initial shock. It entered a state of vascular dormancy, integrating itself into the host's DNA and waiting for the right biological trigger to reactivate. The survivors were the unintentional carriers of a virus that had spent 30 years learning how to hide from the human immune system, a silent passenger waiting for the clock to run out. The life of an Epsilon survivor was one of constant fear and medical scrutiny. They were the people who had seen the worst night in human history and were now being told that the nightmare was still inside them. This latent infection was the final middle finger from William Birkin to the world that had betrayed him. He'd created a virus that couldn't be killed by a bomb, only hidden. These survivors were the only living records of the Raccoon City outbreak, and their blood was more valuable to the black market than any laboratory sample. They were biological artifacts of a dead city. The government's attempts to hide these survivors were only partially successful. Groups like the Connections and Victor Gideon realized that the Epsilon strain had spent decades maturing within these hosts, potentially creating a stabilized version of the virus that could be harvested. This led to a secret war over the survivors, as different factions tried to claim the last pieces of Umbrella's legacy. Raccoon City hadn't ended on October 1st. It had just moved into the veins of the people who made it out. They were the long shadow of the T-virus, a reminder that the original sin of the 1966 expedition was still being paid for in the 21st century. Many of these survivors tried to live normal lives, unaware that their bodies were essentially storage units for the most dangerous pathogen in history, and they formed support groups and shared their stories. But they couldn't escape the fact that they were different. Every cold or fever was a source of panic, a fear that the virus was finally waking up. This psychological burden was as heavy as the biological one. They were the people who outran the bomb, but couldn't outrun their own blood. The Epsilon strain had made them immortal in a way they never asked for, and now that immortality was coming due. The medical files on these survivors are a catalogue of human resilience and corporate cruelty. They show a virus that had become so perfectly adapted to the human host that it could stay silent for decades. This was Birkin's ultimate achievement, a virus that didn't just kill, but stayed. The survivors were the proof that the T-virus was a permanent change to the human race. They were the bridge to the future, carrying the blueprint for the next generation of bioweapons within their own cells. Raccoon City was a memory for the world, but for the survivors, it was a heartbeat. Part 31. Raccoon City Syndrome, the latent T-virus that stayed dormant in survivors for decades. In 2026, 28 years after the fall of Raccoon City, the medical world was hit by a new and terrifying phenomenon known as Raccoon City Syndrome. The survivors who had carried the dormant Epsilon strain for nearly 3 decades began to exhibit symptoms as their immune systems naturally aged. The virus, which had been in a state of vascular dormancy, began to reactivate, mapping the host's impending death through a series of black, bruise-like markings that appeared across the body. It was a slow, agonizing process that proved the T-virus was finally ready to collect its debt. It wasn't a new outbreak. It was a decades-old promise finally being kept. Raccoon City Syndrome was a biological clock that had finally run out. The virus wasn't turning the hosts into zombies anymore. It was simply consuming them from the inside out. The black markings were a sign of the virus rewriting the circulatory system. turning the blood into a delivery system for its final, lethal stage. It was a unique condition that only affected the original Raccoon City survivors, making it a highly localized but devastating tragedy. The world watched as the heroes of 98 were slowly taken by the very thing they had fought so hard to escape. It was a final, cruel twist in a story that should have ended years ago. The syndrome was a masterpiece of viral persistence. It showed that Birkin had successfully created a virus that could survive for a human lifetime without ever losing its potency. The reactivation was triggered by the natural decline of cellular health, making it an inevitable conclusion for anyone who had been in the city during the outbreak. It was the ultimate expression of Spencer's God King ambition, a virus that owned the host's life from the moment of infection until the moment of death. The survivors were no longer people. They were the final ripening of an Umbrella experiment that had taken 30 years to finish. This period was marked by a sense of quiet dread among the remaining survivors. There was no cure for Raccoon City syndrome, only palliative care. The survivors had spent their lives fighting bioterrorism, only to realize that they were the ultimate bioweapon. This irony was not lost on the medical community, who struggled to understand how a virus could stay hidden for so long. The syndrome was the final chapter of the T-virus timeline, a slow-motion outbreak that was claiming the last witnesses to Umbrella's crimes. It was a reminder that the T-virus doesn't forget, and it doesn't let go. The black bruises, known as the map, would spread across the limbs and torso, following the path of the veins. It was a visual record of the virus taking control of the host one last time. For the survivors, it was a terrifying confirmation that the past was never truly behind them. They were being consumed by the very event that had defined their lives. The medical facilities became quiet galleries of this final mutation, as the world's most experienced bioweapon experts watched their friends and colleagues fade away. It was a tragedy that was both deeply personal and globally significant. Raccoon City syndrome proved that the T-virus was a generational threat. It didn't just destroy a city, it poisoned a lineage. The survivors who had thought they were the lucky ones were now the victims of a biological long game. This syndrome was the final proof that Umbrella's research was a crime against the future, not just the present. As the last of the survivors began to show symptoms, the world realized that the legacy of Raccoon City would only end when the last witness was gone. It was a silent, black conclusion to a story written in blood and fire. Part 32. Victor Gideon and the Connections, the people who found the Dormant Strain and understood what it could become. As Raccoon City syndrome began to claim the lives of survivors, a man named Victor Gideon emerged from the shadows of the Umbrella remnants. Gideon was a scientist who had worked in the company's final years and had spent decades tracking the Epsilon survivors. He realized that the reactivation of the virus was not just a medical tragedy, but a unique biological opportunity. He believed that the Epsilon DNA, having matured and stabilized within a human host for 30 years, was the key to a new and even more powerful viral agent. Gideon worked with the Connections to begin a covert harvest of the infected survivors, viewing their suffering as a laboratory asset. Gideon's plan was known as Project Elpis, but its initial stages were purely predatory. He viewed the dying survivors as biological fruit that was finally ready to be picked. He used the resources of the Connections to abduct survivors and bring them to secret facilities where their blood and tissue could be processed. He wasn't looking to save them. He was looking to refine the T-virus into its ultimate, final form. Gideon believed that this stabilized Epsilon DNA would allow him to create a virus that granted all the gifts of the Progenitor Strain, without any of the risks of mutation or rot. He was a man who saw potential in the middle of a funeral. The connections provided Gideon with the political and financial cover he needed to operate in the 2026 landscape. They saw the value in a perfected T-virus, which is something that could be used to create a new generation of elite humans or unstoppable soldiers. Gideon was the modern heir to Spencer's vision, but he had the advantage of 30 years of data and the matured biology of the Raccoon City survivors. He was the man who understood that the T-virus was a legacy that had to be harvested, not a disease that had to be cured. His work was the final, desperate gasp of the Umbrella ideology, reborn in a new era of corporate greed. The harvest was a brutal affair, targeting the people who had already suffered the most. Gideon didn't care about the ethics of his research. He only cared about the results. He saw himself as the one who would finally finish what Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus had started in 1966. He believed that the T-virus was a gift that humanity had been too weak to handle, and he was the one who would finally make it work. Victor Gideon was the ghost of Umbrella, a reminder that as long as the virus existed, there would always be someone willing to kill to control it. He was the final scientist in a timeline built on corpses. Gideon's facilities were clinical and cold, designed to extract every drop of usable material from the survivors. He watched the progression of Raccoon City syndrome with a fascinaton that was purely scientific. To him, the black bruises weren't a sign of death. They were a sign of the virus reaching its peak. He documented the final hours of the heroes of 98 with the same detachment that Marcus had used on his trainees. It was a full circle for the T-virus, returning to the cold, clinical roots of the people who first stole it from Africa. Gideon was the end of the line, a man who built his future on the ruins of the past. The connections were happy to fund his obsession as long as it produced a product they could sell. They weren't interested in God Kings. They were interested in the bottom line. Gideon provided them with the promise of a weapon that was perfectly adapted to human biology. Project Elpis was the culmination of 60 years of horror, a final attempt to leash the progenitor legacy. But Gideon had forgotten the lesson that every Umbrella scientist eventually learned. You don't control the virus controls you. His attempt to harvest the survivors was the final act of arrogance in a story defined by it. Part 33, Elpis. The only thing in the franchise that could end what the T-virus started. In the final stages of his research, Victor Gideon's work took a surprising and ironic turn. As he attempted to stabilize the Epsilon DNA, he accidentally produced a new agent that he named Elpis. This wasn't a more powerful virus. It was a universal antiviral, a biological agent designed to seek out and purge every progenitor derivative strain from the human body. Elpis was the antonym to the T-virus, a way to undo 60 years of biological damage with a single injection. It was the atonement that Spencer had secretly worked on in his final years, a way to clean the slate and start over after a lifetime of evil. Elpis was designed to be as aggressive as the T-virus, but with a constructive purpose. It would move through the host's system, identifying the viral RNA and breaking it down at a cellular level. It was the only cure for Raccoon City syndrome, and the only thing that could finally end the global threat of the T-virus. The irony was that the man who wanted to create the ultimate weapon had instead created the ultimate cure. Elpis represented the end of the line for the progenitor legacy, a way for the world to finally step out from the shadow of the 1966 expedition and be free of the rot. The development of Elpis was the turning point for the franchise's timeline in 2026. It offered a way for the survivors to finally be free of the infection that had lived in their blood for decades. However, Elpis was also a threat to those who still profited from the bioweapons trade. If the T-virus could be cured, it was no longer a viable weapon. This led to a final, violent confrontation over the Elpis samples, as the world's most dangerous organizations fought to either secure the cure or destroy it forever. Elpis was the last hope for a world that had been poisoned by corporate greed. The cure was a biological miracle, but it came at a high cost. It required the very samples Gideon had harvested from the dying survivors. The sacrifice of the Raccoon City heroes was what finally provided the material needed to save the future. Elpis was the legacy of the city, a way for the tragedy of 98 to finally result in something good. It was the final word on the T-virus timeline, a quiet conclusion to a story that had begun with a single flower in a West African cave. The world could finally move forward, but it would never forget the price of the atonement or the people who paid it. Elpis worked by rewriting the very receptors the T-virus used to enter the cells. It was a biological lock that the virus couldn't pick. Once administered, the host would undergo a brief, intense fever as the antiviral purged the system. For the survivors, this was the first time in 30 years they could breathe without fear. The black markings of Raccoon City syndrome would fade, leaving only the scars of their journey. It was a moment of grace in a world that had seen very little of it. The cure wasn't just a medicine. It was a declaration that the era of Umbrella was finally over. The distribution of Elpis was a massive undertaking, coordinated by the remaining heroes and the few institutions that hadn't been compromised. It was the final mission for people like Leon and Chris, a way to finish the job they had started in the ruins of their youth. The cure was sent across the globe, neutralizing the black market strains and ending the localized outbreaks. The T-virus was finally being pushed back into the shadows. Elpis was the final victory of the human spirit over the corporate machine, a way to ensure that the flower in Africa would never again be used to destroy a city. Part 34. What the T-virus means for the whole franchise. Every major event that traces back to one flower in West Africa. The T-virus is the original sin of the Resident Evil world. Every catastrophe, from the fall of Raccoon City to the infection of the Baker family and the tragedy in Eastern Europe, can be traced back to that single expedition in 1966. The power vacuum left by Umbrella's collapse and the proliferation of their research created a world where the horror is no longer an exception, but a constant threat. The T-virus isn't just a pathogen. It's the foundation of a new era of human history, where the monsters are built in boardrooms and the villains wear suits. It's the engine that drives the nightmare. When you look at the Las Plagas, the mold, or the C-virus, you are looking at the children of the Progenitor Virus. They are the variations on a theme that Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus first hummed in a West African cave. The pursuit of biological perfection at the cost of human life is the thread that connects every chapter of this story. The T-virus taught the world that biology is just another resource to be exploited, and that the human race is just a collection of data points waiting to be rewritten. It's a legacy of institutional rot and corporate arrogance that can never be fully undone, even with a cure. The story of the T-virus is also a story of survival. It's about the few people like Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire who refuse to be broken by the monsters Umbrella built. They are the resistance against the God King vision of Oswell Spencer. Their lives have been defined by a war that keeps expanding, a battle against a virus that refuses to stay dead. The T-virus created a world of corpses, but it also created a generation of heroes who have spent 30 years trying to clean up a corporate mess. They are the only light in a world that Umbrella tried to plunge into darkness. Ultimately, the T-virus means that the world is no longer a safe place. The flower in West Africa was a gift that was stolen and turned into a curse. It showed us that the real horror isn't the zombie at the door, but the corporation that put it there. The T-virus is a reminder that as long as there are people who value profit over life, the monsters will keep coming. It's the engine of the franchise, a biological legacy that has rewritten the world's map and its future. The T-virus is where it started, and even with the cure, its shadow will always be a part of human history. The franchise has moved on to new viruses and new threats, but the T-virus remains the benchmark. It's the standard by which all other biological weapons are measured. Its influence is seen in the architecture of the labs, the tactics of the bioterrorists, and the scars on the survivors. It's a ghost that haunts every new entry, a reminder of the city that died so the world could learn to be afraid. The T-virus is the DNA of the series, a fundamental truth that can't be ignored. It's the story of how a few milliliters of liquid changed what it means to be human. As the timeline moves forward, the T-virus remains the most important chapter. It's the starting point for every conversation about ethics, science, and survival in this world. The flower still grows in Africa, and the ruins of the mansion still sit in the mountains. But the real legacy is in the people who are still standing. The T-virus was a test that the world barely passed, and its meaning is found in the resilience of those who refuse to let it win. It's a story of horror, but more than that, it's a story of the human cost of a corporation's ambition.